And the next one up is a special favorite of mine. It's a Spotlight Ignite, actually, a 10-minute long one, and it's about open source. So, we all use open source, but do we really understand what it means? And that's a very interesting question to discuss, and I'm going to discuss that with Zeev. Zeev is one of the creators of the PHP programming language and has a lot of mileage with the open source software. He'll make an order in the OSS licenses and their implications, even as much as Stack Overflow copy pasting that we're all used to. So let me add Zeev. Hey, Zeev. Good morning.
Hi. Hi there.
Great. Looking forward to hearing more about your insights about what we don't know and we should know about open source licensing. So let me share your screen, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Natan. So let's get started. So the first I want to try and explain why I think it matters. And the reason is that many developers, arguably probably most developers, and potentially even some of you, think that if you can find source code that helps you solve a problem or complete your task or implement some part of your system, then the fact that you have a visual of it means you can just use it. Unfortunately, the fact that you have the source code available does not necessarily mean you're allowed to use it. And even if you are allowed to use it, it does not necessarily mean you're allowed to use it without any strings attached. Open source licenses sometimes, actually often, do have all sorts of requirements. And if you violate those requirements, knowingly or unknowingly, that could have ramifications. And this could be all sorts of ramifications. So, for instance, you could get sued by the copyright holder. Maybe in a less extreme situation, the copyright holder may show up and ask you to pay up for a commercial license. Another arguably worse implication is that you may be subject to losing parts or potentially even all of your intellectual property, because some of these licenses have requirements that require you to publish your source code if you use their source code in turn. And that is if those first two issues are typically kick in if your violation becomes public. But even if it doesn't become public, then in situations of M&A and acquisitions, during the due diligence, almost always the acquirer will be scanning your source code to check the license use, and especially open source license use. Make sure you're not using anything that you're not supposed to use or using it outside of the license terms. And it would be kind of a bummer to bump into such a hurdle in kind of a late stage acquisition. So now that we've hopefully established why it matters, let's see what we need to know. So at a super high level, there are 3 different types of families of licenses that you're likely to bump into. It's a gross generalization, but that's kind of as good as we're going to get in an Ignite talk. So the first family is the no strings attached kind of licenses. And those are, from a developer's point of view, those are ideal because, well, essentially, there are no strings attached. You can simply use the code without any special requirements. Sometimes, actually, often there's an attribution requirement that requires you to mention the source, to mention that you're using that package or that source. But other than that, there's usually just not any special requirements. And even if you forget to, even if you don't pay attention to the attribution requirement, typically no one is going to come after you. Licenses that are in that family are the BSD license, the MIT license, the Apache license, and many more other licenses. And they're used by a lot of projects, including, obviously, Apache, PHP, Node.js, and many, many other projects. So those, if you're using any of those and you have not been paying attention to open source licensing, probably there's nothing much you can do. If you want to really be a good open source citizen, then handle attribution, but that's about it. The second family is the copyleft licenses, which are also commonly referred to as VIA licenses, which is kind of very appropriate in 2020. These are exactly the antithesis to the BSD style licenses, as they come with a gigantic string that is attached, and that requires code that uses them to become available under the same license terms. And in that sense, they're kind of like infecting your source code. Anything that touches them and uses them, they infect that code also with the same license, and that is why they are often referred to as biolicenses. The most notable license in that family is the GPL, the GNU Public License, with most of its variants, version 2, version 3, LGPL, and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of software that uses them too, probably as much as BSD style licenses, including MySQL and the Linux kernel and WordPress and so on. So if you're using those, it's not always an issue, because those licenses typically, the viral nature of them typically kicks in when you distribute your software. But be advised that distributing your software is not just limited to making it publicly available. It's also, if you send it to a specific client, it constitutes distribution, and this viral nature kicks in. If you have it as a part of your JavaScript front end, then by definition your source gets distributed to the browser, and that also constitutes distribution. So GPL, not necessarily impossible to use it in a commercial environment, but you really have to know what you're doing. And if you're not sure, you should get some advice, or search your web and so on. There's another variant, by the way, I'm not going to spend too much time on it, the AGPL, the third GPL, and this one is more dangerous. It's a lot more, it's kind of like a mutation that is a lot more infectious, because it kicks in even if you're using it only at the backend and you don't distribute it. But thankfully, it's not very, very common. The third family is everything else. And there's a lot of different types of licenses that are not BSD style or GPL style. I'm not going to cover all of them, but maybe I do want to touch two subfamilies. The first one is the source available licenses. Source available licenses are not open source licenses. They don't give you the same kinds of rights that all open source licenses do. Typically, or not typically, but sometimes, or maybe even often, they don't give you any rights at all to use the software. So the source code is available, but potentially that's about it. You're still not necessarily entitled to use it in any environment, and certainly not necessarily in a commercial environment. This is actually, these are maybe more common than you think, because they are central to a new business model, the open core model, where in many cases the core, the center of the project is open source using a traditional open source license, like the one belonging to the previous two families. And there are all sorts of peripheral or kind of enterprisey features that may be licensed under a source code available license, but you may still need to purchase a commercial license in order to use them. So be advised, again, going back to my place at the beginning, the first that you can see the source code does not at all mean that you're allowed to use it, and definitely that you're not necessarily allowed to use it with no strings attached. The last subfamily of the everything else I want to touch is code where no license is mentioned, and you might think that means that you can just use it, when in fact the opposite is true. If no license is mentioned, then by default in most places the author reserves all the rights, even if they don't want to. That's the default, and you need to get explicit permission from the author in order to use it. So be advised, if you find a piece of code on the web that doesn't mention any license, not sure that you should just use it. That part actually got me thinking while I was researching for this talk. Even though I have been around open source licenses for many, many years, I was wondering what's going on with Stack Overflow. That's kind of what we think about when we think about getting a piece of code off the web. And I was pretty sure that they handle it somehow, but I was curious how they made sure that you copying and pasting a few lines of code from the website will not automatically expose you to license issues. So I checked, and I was kind of surprised with what I found. Hold on. So yeah, this is where you go to if you look for the what license Stack Overflow is under. that in itself is a bit off-putting because there's a lot of detail here, not like simple human readable terms. But essentially, they're using the Creative Commons. It's a very popular license for sharing knowledge. Wikipedia uses it. Some photos on Flickr use it, and so on and so forth. So I was looking to see, the most recent version, and if you dive into it, then it begins here where you're free to share and adapt. That looks great. But if you scroll down a bit, there are some requirements. The first one is the attribution requirement. We touched that earlier. No big deal. But then there's the share-like requirement, which if you read it, if you remix, transform, or build upon the material, you must distribute your contributions under the same license as the original. That kind of sounds horrible. If you take a piece of code from Stack Overflow, does it mean that you now have to, make everything available on the Creative Commons? That can't be true. So I searched a bit more, and I found, hold on, first of all, I found this. So there's this post with 531 votes, and, long story short, they're going to, starting February 1st, 2016, they're going to start to license those code snippets under the MIT license. The MIT license, super permissive, nothing attached. Awesome. But I was thinking, how come it doesn't mention it on the Stack Overflow website? So there's a follow-up that if you go into the follow-up, it's less popular. There's minus 337 votes here. And essentially they're saying, bummer, the changes proposed here will be delayed indefinitely. We'll get back to and open some more discussions in the future, which, to the best of my knowledge, they never have. For whatever reasons, they never changed the license, even for new contributions, and everything on Stack Overflow is still licensed under Creative Commons. What that means, it's a bit up for debate, but generally there's definitely that if you take substantial parts from Stack Overflow, which could be just a few lines of code, it's been to code of laws in the past. Potentially, you have to make all of your source code. You have to expose all of your source code under the Creative Commons. I hope that you can hear me. I was told that I'm having mic issues. I hope that they're getting better. Takeaways to summarize. Jatan, it's not.
We can hear just a bit of disruptions on the microphone, but go ahead with the summary.
Okay, so just to summarize, first of all, remember that seeing the source code does not necessarily equate to being allowed to use it. It often doesn't. So it does make sense, and it is important to take a look at the license before you use it. And if you don't understand what the license means, then get some consultation, not necessarily from a lawyer, preferably not a lawyer, but maybe a friend that has a better understanding of how open source licensing works. Beware of source available licenses, AGPL, and no license, because those can very frequently be problematic. They typically are problematic more often than not. If you distribute software, including JavaScript in your front-end code or sending a deployment into a specific customer, you also need to be aware of copyleft licenses like GPL. And finally, and this is kind of your decision whether you take the red pill or the blue pill, I would go in the direction of being inspired by Stack Overflow solutions, but probably avoid copying and pasting stuff from there. But of course, it is up to you whether you want to ignore it or take it into consideration. And with that, I'd like to thank you, and feel free to contact me, and have a great rest of the conference.
Thank you very much, Zeev. I think especially the thing about Stack Overflow, that was the most staggering thing for me, like to realize that we've the common practice of copy
for me as well.
Stack Overflow has such implication, and it's been so long around, and still we're not aware of that. So thanks very much for sharing that with us. We're a bit short on time, so guys, we won't be able to have a Q&A now, but Zeev will be available for you on the Discord. So do share the questions there.